in Nashville. He has been in Nashville as long as I have been, I think about 30 years, but he has more practice before he came here in Northeast. He's an Amherst graduate and he has a doctorate in clinical psychology. And he has been with us, especially in the Nashville psychotherapy crowd, a very active member. He was the president, ran the newsletter, and he's been encouraging so many therapists and mentored so many therapists in this area. And in Nashville, he's well known, and he's teaching at Vanderbilt, and he's well known. And for me, I had the pleasure of being his partner in his practice for a few years, and I'm familiar with his background, his mother being a dentist and a professor here in Nashville in Meharry Medical College, and he being of Jewish background, and now he's married to a previously Muslim, and he sees the world in a lot of different angles, and I'm very happy that he's embraced Buddhist thinking for a long time. I remember that, but now I'm sure over the years of working with families, individuals, helping them grow, I'm sure he has found the right vocabulary and the right message for all of us, so that he's known to be the psychologist of the elite, the educated people with masters and PhD. They should go to Philip Channon because he can connect with them in their intellectual level. That's why he's special for us. Anyway, without any further ado, I'll let him. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Veda, for that very generous introduction. I will start with my spiritual autobiography. My awareness of a spiritual dimension to life is probably rooted in my childhood and adolescent experiences as a Southern Baptist. Wednesday night church suppers and prayer meetings, singing in youth choirs, emotional revival meetings, and the abiding belief that there was a God who answered prayers, and also an eternal hereafter. I was a true believer and never allowed a curse word to pass my lips until after I'd gone to college. In fact, I sold Bibles door to door for the Southwestern Company during the summer after high school to earn the tuition for my first semester of college. During my first 3 months at college in the small New England town of Amherst, Massachusetts, I would walk to the Baptist church on Sunday mornings. Certainly, I knew no other Amherst College freshman who rolled out of bed on Sunday mornings to do this. And by December, I'd also decided to sleep in. At that point, my beliefs had not changed, but going to church had become less important. The summer after my sophomore year at college, I flew to Hawaii and spent my mornings and early afternoons on Waikiki Beach, and my late afternoons and evenings working as a hotel parking lot attendant, which gave me lots of time for reading. I read Eric Fromm's books, The Art of Loving and The Dogma of Christ, which altered forever the Christian belief system of my first 20 years. I realized that I could no longer believe that there was a God who intervened in the actions of the world. I then flew home to Nashville at the end of the summer and experienced a depression which lasted for maybe 3 weeks. I was experiencing the loss of a certainty about life and the loss of a belief system to which I could no longer subscribe. From then on, I continued to attend my mother's church, Emmanuel Baptist Church on Belmead Boulevard, when I was home on vacations from college and graduate school, but I no longer believed most of what was said and sung. It was clear to me that the tragedies and pain of the world were far too great to believe that there was a God who was actually listening to people's prayers and taking any actions as a result. During graduate school in 1974, I helped start a men's group, which included several men who were attenders at the town of Amherst Quaker meeting. I began to also attend and became close friends with a man named Frank Cully, whom I first met in the men's group. Frank is 14 years older than I am, and he'd previously been a Trappist monk living in silence from the ages of 21 to 36 at Berryville Monastery in rural Virginia. I spent many hours with Frank, often on long walks in the woods around his cabin outside Amherst, talking about many things, including life and love and spiritual paths. Another man in the men's group, Kent Poe, who was also a psychologist, had spent the summer of 1974 at Naropa, a Buddhist study center in Boulder, Colorado. When I talked in the group about my unsatisfying experience with transcendental meditation, Kent encouraged me to attend Naropa in order to learn a more authentic Buddhist meditation. The following summer, in June 1975, I finished my doctoral program and then camped out cross-country with my good friend, Alan Davis. I enrolled at Naropa in an intensive 5-week course in Vipassana meditation taught by Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, and Sharon Salzberg. We meditated 3 to 4 hours a day and all day on Sundays, when we had an audience with Naropa's founder, Trungpa Rinpoche. We listened to many compelling Dharma talks by Jack and Joseph and Sharon. These teachers brought a wonderfully eclectic approach to spiritual practice, and they read to us from the mystical practitioners of many faiths, from Thomas Merton, the Sufis, the Hasidic masters, the desert monks of Palestine, and of course from Buddhist texts such as the Dhammapada. It became clear to me that these mystical practitioners, speaking from such diverse perspectives across continents and over 2,000 years, had all said very similar things about the nature of God and spiritual practice. That summer's experience at Naropa did give me a perspective which has strongly shaped my path, has stayed with me, and has led me to continue to read, to meditate, and to look for the intersections of spiritual and psychotherapy practice. I've often thought about how spiritual and psychological work have led me in very similar directions. I moved back to Nashville in 1991, having not been a church member for 25 years. A psychologist colleague, Jane High, introduced me to the Unitarian Church, which I found unexpectedly to be a haven for other seekers such as myself, who are looking for a spiritual community which draws upon many sources of religious inspiration and which believes deeply that there's no single route to follow in trying to lead a spiritually informed life. As Jack Kornfield writes in his wonderful book, A Path with Heart, spiritually mature persons understand that there is not just one way of practice or one fine spiritual tradition, but there are many ways. Their flexibility understands that spiritual life is not about adopting any one particular philosophy or set of beliefs or teachings, that it is not a cause for taking a stand in opposition to someone else or something else. In place of arrogance, the Buddha recommends freedom and reminds his followers that those who grasp at philosophies and views simply wander around the world annoying people. The flexibility of heart brings a humor to spiritual practice. It allows us to see that there are 100,000 skillful means of awakening. I view myself as a Buddhist psychologist, finding great value in the Buddhist understanding of the nature of mind, in how Buddhism sees attachment and aversion as the primary sources of human suffering, and in its focus on meditation practice as the basic path to freedom and suffering, to freedom of suffering. As Sylvia Boorstein so wonderfully puts it, pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. I enjoy bringing meditation and Buddhist practice into my professional life. I continue to look for ways that psychological growth and spiritual practice intersect, and to understand how traditional religious ideas can be reframed into more holistic and helpful concepts. When they asked him how to pray, Thomas Merton said, "Pray, what's that? Pray is how I breathe." I remember Jack Kornfield telling us paradoxically at Naropa, the psychological task of life is to build a self. The spiritual task of life is to let go of self. And these two tasks continue throughout our lives. I'd like to share with you from an article I wrote on the Buddhist Eightfold Path and the karmic law of cause and effect. And I start with a quote from S.N. Goenka in the book, An Introduction to the Buddha and His Teachings. Our task is to eradicate suffering by eradicating its causes: ignorance, craving, and aversion. To achieve this goal, the Buddha discovered, followed, and taught a practical way to this attainable end. He called this way the Noble Eightfold Path. Once, when asked to explain the path in simple words, the Buddha said, "Abstain from all unwholesome deeds, perform wholesome ones, purify your mind." The mind is truly purified not by performing religious ceremonies or intellectual exercises, but by experiencing directly the reality of oneself and working systematically to remove the conditioning that gives rise to suffering. The Buddha lived and taught some 2,500 years ago. Western psychotherapists have become increasingly interested in the relevance of the Buddha's teaching to our modern day practice of psychotherapy. Patients seek us out for help with their anxiety, depression, relationships, and careers. Patients are often unhappy with their lives and are desperate for guidance. The Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path and the karmic law of cause and effect offer wisdom for us to distill to our patients. According to Goenka, who was one of the best known Buddhist teachers, the Noble Eightfold Path can be divided into 3 stages of training: Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. Shila is moral practice, abstention from all unwholesome actions of body and speech. Samadhi is the practice of concentration, developing the ability to consciously direct and control one's own mental processes. Prajna is wisdom, the development of purifying insight into one's own nature. Three parts of the Noble Eightfold Path fall within the training of Shila: right speech, right action, right livelihood. So, number 1, right speech. Patients and couples often come to psychotherapy describing angry and hurtful interactions with spouses, children, and other family members. To put right speech into action, patients must be determined to bring a higher awareness and intention to every word that they speak. As my first meditation teacher, Jack Kornfield, writes, the development of awareness in meditation allows us to become mindful enough or conscious enough to recognize our heart and intentions as we go through the day. Practice it with your speech. Pay very careful attention and notice the state of your heart, the intention as you speak about even the smallest matter. Is your intention to be protected, to grasp, to defend yourself? Is your intention to open out of concern, compassion, or love? That's from Kornfield's book, A Path with Heart, a guide through the perils and promises of spiritual life. Number 2, right action. Just as right speech means to avoid causing harm with what you say, right action means avoiding causing harm with what you do. In place of physically hurting others through your actions, instead you seek to help and protect them. Describing a person who practices right action, the Buddha said, laying aside the rod and sword, he is careful to harm none, full of kindness, seeking the good of all creatures. A few days ago, I spoke with a patient who described a recent encounter with his girlfriend. He said, she got in my face, so I threw a glass of wine in her face. This was not right action. Recently, I was working with a couple whose conflict developed into a physical altercation. The police were called, the husband spent several hours in jail, and the court and lawyers' fees totaled $6,000. Number 3, right livelihood. As psychotherapists, we can stress to our patients the importance of right livelihood for overall well-being. As Jack Kornfield once said, try to meditate after stealing all day. 3 parts of the Noble Eightfold Path fall within the training of meditation or samadhi: right effort, right awareness, and right concentration. Right effort. Regarding meditation instruction, Goenka writes, the breath is an object of attention that is readily available to everyone because we all breathe from the time of birth until the time of death. It is a universally acceptable, accessible object of meditation. When we notice that the mind has wandered away, patiently and calmly, we bring it back again. We fail and try again and again. The task requires repeated, continuous practice, as well as patience and calmness. Patients come to psychotherapy with very busy minds. They often have great difficulty turning their minds off, even to be able to go to sleep. As Buddhist informed psychotherapists, we can encourage our patients to develop a meditation practice. Many apps are now available that can be helpful and encouraging, such as Headspace and Calm and 10% Happier. We can agree with our patients that meditation is difficult and requires sustained practice and patience. Number 5, right awareness. Meditation is a powerful practice for learning to live in the present moment. As Goenka says, the mind spends most of the time lost in fantasies and illusions, reliving pleasant or unpleasant experiences, and anticipating the future with eagerness or fear. While lost in such cravings or aversions, we are unaware of what is happening right now, what we are doing right now. Yet surely this moment, now, is the most important for us. We cannot live in the past, it is gone. Nor can we live in the future, it is forever beyond our grasp. We can live only in the present. Many of our patients present with sometimes unbearable anxiety, constantly worrying and anticipating the worst. As a patient told me a few days ago, I'm this worry machine. I catastrophize. It's hard to relax. Meditation can be a wonderful practice for letting go of negative scenarios and learning to live in the present moment. Number 6, right concentration. As Goenka writes, it takes time to change the ingrained mental habits formed over many years. This can be done only by working repeatedly, continuously, patiently, and persistently. Our job is simply to return attention to our breathing as soon as we notice that it has strayed. Gradually, the periods of forgetfulness become shorter, and the periods of sustained awareness, samadhi, become longer. The final 2 parts of the Noble Eightfold Path fall within the training of prajna or wisdom, right thought and right understanding. And this is a quote from an article on meditation and psychotherapy in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Therapies break the hold of past conditioning on present behavior. Meditation tries to alter the process of conditioning per se. As a result, the meditator realizes his or her role as writer-director of these inner dramas and discovers the element of choice in the cutting and editing of perceptions of reality. This responsibility for choices becomes clear. The meditator is able to identify and abort the circular conditioned mind habits that before had continued to linger and reverberate as ruminations and purposeless obsessions. And finally, number 8, right understanding. There are 3 kinds of wisdom or prajna: received wisdom, intellectual wisdom, and experiential wisdom. As Goenka writes, received wisdom is not one's own wisdom. It is borrowed wisdom. Intellectual understanding is still not one's own insight, whereas experiential wisdom arises out of one's own experience, out of personal realization of truth. This is the wisdom that one lives, real wisdom that will bring about a change in one's life by changing the very nature of the mind. In the book, Thoughts Without a Thinker, Psychotherapy from a Buddhist Perspective by Mark Epstein, Dr. Epstein suggests a distinct similarity in the methods of Freud and the Buddha. To his great credit, Freud discovered the importance of the therapist learning to attend non-judgmentally to whatever came into the patient's mind. There's no evidence, according to Epstein, that Freud was influenced directly by Buddhist practices, but the resemblance of his attentional recommendations to those of the Buddha cannot be denied. Freud repeatedly admonished psychoanalysts to suspend judgment and give impartial attention to everything there is to observe. Thus, the promise of Buddhist-informed psychotherapy is learning to pay attention to one's mind and to one's every action on the path of gaining real wisdom, experiential wisdom. Then there's the law of karma. Just as the Noble Eightfold Path describes a plan for leading a fulfilling life and alleviating suffering, the law of karma helps us to understand the constant workings of cause and effect in our lives. Many people have the idea that karma is synonymous with fate, as in, it's just his karma. However, the Buddhist teachings on karma make clear that a fuller meaning of the term involves, in Jack Kornfield's words, the way that cause and effect govern the patterns that repeat themselves throughout all life. The Buddhists say that understanding is enough to live wisely in the world. Jack Kornfield goes on to say, we can understand the workings of karma in our lives by looking at this process of cause and effect in our ordinary activities and by observing how the repetitive patterns of our own mind affect our behavior. These patterns and tendencies are often much stronger than our conscious intentions. Whatever our circumstances, it is old habits that will create the way that we live. Kornfield continues, if we are not aware, our life will simply follow the pattern of our past habits over and over again. But if we can awaken, we can make conscious choices in how we respond to the circumstances of our lives. Our conscious response will then create our future karma. We must see that karma has 2 distinct aspects: that which is the result of our past, and that karma which our present responses are creating for our future. We receive the results of past action. This we cannot change. But as we respond to in the present, we also create new karma. We sow the karmic seeds for new results in our future lives. Thus, Buddhist psychology puts great emphasis on our intentions in all of our actions. As Jack Kornfield writes, the intention or attitude that we bring to each situation of life determines the kind of karma that we create. Day to day, moment to moment, we can begin to see the creation of the patterns of karma based on the intentions of our heart. Persist in your good intention and observe the kinds of responses it eventually elicits. Try responding only when your heart is open and kind. When you don't feel this way, wait and let the difficult feelings pass. The Buddha begins his teachings in the great Dhammapada by saying, "We are what we think. All that we are arises from our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with an impure mind, and trouble will follow you as the wheel follows the ox that draws the cart. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with a pure mind, and happiness will follow you as your shadow, unshakable." Also want to share with you an article that I wrote about anger management from both Buddhist and Western psychological perspectives. Who has not felt guilt or remorse about an angry outburst or someone we cared about? Surely this is a universal problem. So how do we learn to manage our anger more skillfully? We can look to both Buddhist and Western psychological perspectives for answers. First of all, we begin with the proposition that all anger is not bad. The Buddhist teacher Sharon Salzberg, in her wonderful book, Loving Kindness, The Revolutionary Art of Happiness, writes, "If we look at the force of anger, we can in fact discover many positive aspects to it. Anger is not a passive, complacent state. It has incredible energy. Anger can impel us to let go of ways we may be inappropriately defined by the needs of others. It can teach us to say no. In this way, it also serves our integrity. It is a way to set boundaries and to challenge injustice at every level." However, let us turn now to the steps involved in managing destructive anger and aggression. I will outline below some of the key concepts and strategies for reining in the urge to respond with the kind of anger that damages relationships and destroys trust. Pema Chodron is one of the world's most renowned and beloved Buddhist teachers. She resides at Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia, the first Tibetan monastery for Westerners. She's an extraordinary teacher about thorny interpersonal problems like anger. She's written many books, and her recorded talks are available in such CD sets as Don't Bite the Hook and Getting Unstuck. Pema Chodron writes, "Someone criticizes you. They criticize your work or your appearance or your child. At moments like that, what is it you feel?" The Tibetan word for this is Shempa, S-H-E-N-P-A. It is usually translated as attachment, but a more descriptive translation might be hooked. When Shempa hooks us, we're likely to get stuck. At the subtlest level, we feel a tightening, a tensing, a sense of closing down. That's the hooked quality. That tight feeling has the power to hook us into self-denigration, blame, anger, jealousy, and other emotions which lead to words and actions that end up poisoning us. Pema Chodron continues, "Yet we don't stop. We can't stop because we're in the habit of associating whatever we're doing with relief from our own discomfort. This is the Shempa syndrome. Shempa is usually involuntary, and it gets right to the root of why we suffer. The momentum behind the urge is so strong that we never pull out of the habitual pattern of turning to poison for comfort. Something triggers an old pattern we'd rather not feel, and we tighten up and get hooked into criticizing or complaining. Working with habitual patterns begins with the willingness to fully acknowledge our urge, and then the willingness not to act on it. This business of not acting is called refraining. Traditionally, it's been called renunciation. We renounce and refrain from the Shimpa. Meditation teaches us to experience the uneasiness and the urge fully, but to interrupt the momentum that usually follows. We learn to stay with the uneasiness, the tightening, the itch of Shimpa. This is how we learn to stop the chain reaction of habitual patterns that otherwise will rule our lives. In her recorded 3-CD set on anger entitled Don't Bite the Hook, it's also available for your phone, Pema Chodron gives a Dharma talk from the 6th chapter of Shanti Deva, who was teaching in the 8th century AD in India at Yolanda University to an audience of celibate monks. Pema Chodron says in her talk to a room which responds with with laughter, "You might wonder what the relevance of such a teaching from 1200 years ago would be today. And yet all I can say is at the level of human neurosis, nothing much has changed." Shanti Deva states, "Good works gathered in 1,000 ages, such as deeds of generosity or offerings to the blissful ones, a single flash of anger shatters them." In her commentary, Pema Chodron says, "The anger causes so much damage to us. Your temper erupts violently and you're either verbally or physically abusive. It shocks our systems so deeply. It shatters a lot of goodwill. It can take a long time to get back to where you were. A single blast of anger shatters the good you have done." It's not going too far to say that a single episode of toxic anger may destroy a lifetime of goodwill and permanently damage a relationship. Another Buddhist concept is Tonglen, spelled Tonglen. Tonglen is perhaps Pema Chodron's foremost spiritual practice. She writes, "Tonglen practice reverses the usual logic of avoiding suffering and seeking pleasure. In Tonglen, we visualize taking in the pain of others with the in-breath and then sending out whatever will benefit the other with the out-breath. Tonglen awakens our compassion. In Tonglen practice, I visualize breathing in another's suffering while breathing out compassion towards them. This can be a powerful way to move past feeling angry at my partner, as I realize that while I am suffering, so is the partner I am angry at. Practicing Tonglen usually doesn't take very long before I feel my anger begin to dissipate." Another of Pema Chodron's concepts is drop the storylines. This is one of her most helpful concepts when it comes to working with anger. The storyline is the story I'm going over and over in my head about how the other person has just said or done something that is unkind, unfair, unjust. As I keep going over these thoughts, it keeps me stirred up and angry. In her book, Comfortable with Uncertainty, Pema Chodron summarizes her approach. Acknowledging that we are all churned up is the first and most difficult step. Without recognition that we're stuck, it's impossible to liberate ourselves from confusion. Doing something different is anything that interrupts our strong tendency to spin out. We can let the storyline go and connect with the underlying energy. Or we can do on-the-spot Tonglen. Or we can remember a slogan. Or we can burst into song. Anything that doesn't reinforce our crippling habits. Interrupting our destructive habits and awakening our heart is the work of a lifetime. In essence, the practice is always the same. Instead of falling prey to a chain reaction of revenge or self-hatred, we gradually learn to catch the emotional reaction and drop the storylines. A Western concept that I utilize with almost all my patients to help them to not take things personally comes from a book entitled How Can I Get Through to You by Terrence Real. He explains an extremely effective strategy for not taking what the other person says or does personally. This strategy involves developing an internal boundary, which Terrence Real describes as a kind of internal technology. The internal boundary is an invisible shield that I psychically construct that protects me from anything the other person says or does that might invoke my anger or defensive reactions. With an internal boundary in place, Real proposes, the nastiest comment, the most raw feeling, an emotional atom bomb could go off and you would remain unfazed. Inside your circle, you can afford to be open, spacious, curious, and relaxed. Real elaborates. The important thing to remember about practicing an internal boundary is precisely that it is a practice similar to getting physically fit. Although it takes months, even years of slow, steady effort before an internal boundary becomes consistent, most people experience an exhilarating glimpse of its effects within a few weeks. The lack of an internal boundary inevitably leads to control or withdrawal. If there is no membrane between you and whatever external stimulus gets thrown at you, then you attempt to regulate your own level of comfort or discomfort by managing the stimulus. I could be happy if only you were less angry. When control fails, the only other option is withdrawal. Pema Chodron, in her book, Living Beautifully with Uncertainty and Change, addresses anger as an addictive type of urge. She writes, many of our escapes are involuntary. Addiction and dissociating from painful feelings are two examples. Anyone who has worked with a strong addiction, compulsive eating, compulsive sex, abuse of substances, explosive anger, or any other behavior that's out of control, knows that when the urge comes on, it's irresistible. The seduction is too strong. So we train again and again in less highly charged situations in which the urge is present, but not so overwhelming. By training with everyday situations, we develop the knack of refraining when the going gets tough. It takes patience and understanding of how we're hurting ourselves and others, not to continue taking the same old escape route of speaking or acting out. Fundamental to Buddhist psychology is the belief that once our basic material and relational needs have been met, what we really long for are positive mind states. Meditation helps us develop more skillful mind states and skillful actions. In her book, Loving Kindness, Sharon Salzberg writes about the fruits of meditation practice as it relates to anger. She writes, anger seems like a solid thing, but in fact, we discover if we observe carefully that anger has no solidity. In reality, it is merely a conditioned response that arises and passes away. It is crucial for us to see that when we identify with these passing states as being solid in who we are, we let them rule us, and we are compelled to act in ways that cause harm to ourselves and others. Our opening needs to rest on the basis of non-identification, recognizing aversion and anger as transitory is very difficult from identifying with them as being who we really are and then acting on them. We can all benefit from continuing to work on more positive mind states and on equanimity, the Buddhist idea of a balanced, calm mind. Anger is a turbulent state that disturbs our equanimity, and so often our relationships. As I recently said to a new couple in my office, the two of you have proved that you know how to get angry and fight with each other. I think it's time now to learn how to treat each other with more care and kindness. Another of Terence Real's concepts, which has a spiritual flavor to it, is called relational heroism. Terence Real writes, relational heroism occurs when every muscle and nerve in one's body pulls one toward reenacting one's usual dysfunctional pattern. But through sheer force of discipline or grace, one lifts oneself off the well-worn track toward behaviors that are more vulnerable, more cherishing, and more mature. Each time the patient feels the physical flood of agitation, depression, and shame sweep over him, but does not run, he has learned to give himself the functional parenting he never received. Such moments lie at the heart of the recovery process. One patient teased me saying, our therapy is like couples therapy between himself and himself. So finally, what I want to do is share from an actual psychotherapy with a patient how I utilize some of these concepts. This therapy case illustrates some of the types of interventions that I typically make with patients suffering from narcissistic wounds, meaning deep wounds to their sense of self. The patient read this talk and gave me permission to present his case. His name, of course, has been changed to preserve his confidentiality. So in the first session, the patient said to me, I'm looking for ways to make life easier on myself. I want to change how I think and reduce my anger. I can be hard to get along with. I affect others around me with my negative attitudes. My coworkers have told me, you're being a jerk. I'm a judgmental person by nature. I can be passive aggressive with bubbling resentment. I'm an iconoclast. At this point in the session, I suggested to David that I was hearing about his lack of inner peace. He responded in the affirmative, saying, my ego is my enemy. He also described debilitating social anxiety, which I often see in patients with chronically low self-esteem. He adds, I go out of my way to not meet other people. It's gotten worse the past couple of years. I'm scared others will know who I am, which is terrifying. David goes on to say, I'm outraged constantly, which exhausts me. It exhausts others when I verbalize it. How do I accept myself and the world? Everything affects me more than other people. I have a lack of hope for the future. I don't want to be angry dad. At the end of that first session, I presented to David the concept of the internal boundary, the invisible psychic shield, to create what's also called emotional insulation. At his second session, 4 days later, David told me that he'd read the internal boundary chapter, and he added, I need a quieting of my mind. I need to spend less time being outraged. It's really easy to get me going. It never makes me feel better, my negative verbalizing about things I don't like. My wife is the main person who takes the brunt of this. At the end of the second session, I introduced to David some of Pema Chodron's ideas from her set, Don't Bite the Hook. Then in the next session, the third session, 10 days later, David told me that he'd listened to Don't Bite the Hook and he'd found it very useful. During this session, it became clear to me that David has a virulent inner critic voice, that he struggles with tremendous underlying shame, and that his aloofness is to a great extent his effort to hide his shame from discovery. I explained to him this narcissistic dynamic, particularly true for men, of converting the painful emotion of shame into grandiosity, of going from less than to better than. During this session, I also introduced David to the concept, the trance of unworthiness, as described by Tara Brach, a Buddhist teacher and psychologist. In her book, Radical Acceptance, Embracing Your Life with the Heart of a Buddha, Tara Brach writes, as a friend of mine put it, feeling that something is wrong with me is the invisible and toxic gas I'm always breathing. When we experience our lives through this lens of personal insufficiency, we are imprisoned in what I call the trance of unworthiness. Trapped in this trance, we are unable to perceive the truth of who we really are. Tara Brach then describes an experience of one of her meditation students at the bedside of the student's dying mother. Shortly before she dies, Tara Brach writes, the mother suddenly opened her eyes and looked clearly and intently at her daughter. You know, the mother whispered softly, all my life I thought something was wrong with me. Shaking her head slightly as if to say, what a waste, she closed her eyes and drifted back into a coma. Several hours later, the mother passed away. Tara Brach concludes, we don't have to wait until we're on our deathbed to realize what a waste of our precious lives it is to carry the belief that something is wrong with us. Yet because our habits of feeling insufficient are so strong, awakening from the trance involves not only inner resolve, but also an active training of the heart and mind. This active training includes meditation and Buddhist teaching on non-judgment and self-compassion. Having introduced these concepts to David in the first 3 sessions, I began to hear from him in his 4th session about his putting these concepts into practice in his own life. He states, I'm shocked at how effective I've been able to be at using these new skills. I've had plenty of opportunities to practice. Pema Chodron is wonderful in Don't Bite the Hook. I'm catching the anger. Here are the tools. I feel committed to using them, making this a daily thing, awakening to these things. I haven't realized the damage they've done to me. A grand project. I see another way to think and go forth in life. It's given me some hope for the future. I was unsure how I could relate to the world. Now I have a way I can process the things the world presents me with. David continues, I'm so wired for outrage. Before I couldn't stop and be with the feelings. That sticky feeling, shempa. dead center in my chest. I feel the surge. By this point, I'd also introduced David to Pema Chodron's concept of dropping the storylines. David elaborates further. Dropping the storyline, physically feel it first. I have released its power over me. The realization that I have that power, it's really a big deal for me. I can't think of a time before that I was able to do that. Trying to catch that rush right when it happens. I'm unexpectedly able to calm down. I'm able to not bite the hook. I can be in the middle of this swarm of things I don't like and not be reactive. I can name and get to know these feelings. It is harder to do at home with my wife, but now I've been given the tools. It's up to me to create the practice and make it something permanent. Resisting the urge, Shempa, constantly pointing out Shempa to myself. There it is. It has a name. How powerful to name the feeling. I'm constantly bombarded with it. David begins to describe how others in his life may perceive the changes he's making. It's a transition for me. People who know me well, they know how I've acted in the past, the incredible damage the anger does. People will have to forgive the way I used to behave, and that will take time. I like imagining a physical barrier for the internal boundary. I haven't had to take a Xanax this week. These Buddhist concepts could change my mind enough to make it possible to not go down those old roads. David begins his 5th psychotherapy session saying, these techniques of fighting off anger with awareness are helping at work. It's still harder at home, applying the same detachment to things my wife says or I want to say. It's a lot harder. These patterns we've established over the years, it's a lot harder to hold back the instantaneous flick of the switch and instead apply the internal boundary force field. It continues to be a challenge. But at work, I'm shocked at how effective it's been in controlling my social anxiety. David continues, I'm reading a great article in the Buddhist magazine, The Lion's Roar. I want to be this way. I want to be a student of these concepts, wherever that will lead me. A way to live in the world. There's no other way that I've seen without doing self-harm. I haven't had to take a Xanax in weeks. Before starting therapy, I had a week when I took one every day. By this point in his treatment, I've also introduced David to the Buddhist concept of metta or loving kindness. I have found this an immensely useful approach in assisting patients with reducing their virulent inner critic voice and substituting a practice of self-compassion, self-acceptance, and self-regard. I encourage patients to develop their own loving kindness phrases, and I give them examples such as loving kindness and compassion towards myself. May I be free from suffering, free from ill will. May I be happy. May I love myself completely, just as I am. 9 days later, David came for his 6th psychotherapy session. He began the session stating, I've been very effective at controlling my opinions and attachments at work. I'm still having trouble at home in showing loving kindness to my wife and not becoming judgmental and angry. It's more difficult to not become attached at home. There are decisions to be made, picking up the kids, grocery shopping. When I'm away from home, my wife develops ways she'd like to do things. I'm an analytical person. I think I can improve on her decisions. I don't do a good job of adjusting my tone. I'm still reeling from years of my having no concept of how I sound. She's used to the way I am, quick to react in a defensive way, which gets her going. Now I'm trying in the moment to just feel the anger and not act on it. At this point in the session, I introduced David to a saying by Singh Stan, the third Zen patriarch, who states, "Do not search for the truth, only cease to cherish opinions." David responds, "It's hard for me to let go of opinions. I'm good at logistics, figuring out a process. It's who I am as a person. I'm an organized person. I can figure out the best way to handle a situation. When I see a process that I deem inefficient, I'm constantly looking for ways to be efficient." David adds, "I'm still fighting off the shame pangs and grandiosity on a daily basis. People can pick up on your shempa, even if you aren't saying anything. I tend to utilize a grandiose way of subverting shame." David continues, "Mindfulness, I want to use it to break out of my judgments. My life has been built around performance-based self-esteem, which is a Terence Real concept, which is so far from enlightenment. I have to work to eventually get out of that mindset. It's always stood in my way, my own judgment. Clearly, I now have enough skill." I'd like to close this presentation with some profound words about the difficulty of learning to love from Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk who lived for almost 30 years at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. Thomas Merton is known for having built a bridge between mystical Catholicism and Buddhism in his writing and in his dialogues with such Buddhists as the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh. One of my favorites of Thomas Merton's many books is entitled The Wisdom of the Desert. It's about the words of the Desert Fathers, who were monks who lived in caves in Palestine in the 4th century AD. In his introduction to their words, Merton writes, "Love takes one's neighbor as one's other self, and loves them with all the immense humility and discretion and reverence and reserve, without which no one can presume to enter into the sanctuary of another's subjectivity. From such love, all authoritarian brutality, all exploitation, domineering, and condescension must necessarily be absent. The charity of the Desert Fathers is not set before us in unconvincing effusions. The full difficulty and magnitude of the task of loving others is recognized everywhere and never minimized. It is hard to really love others if love is to be taken in the full sense of the word. Love demands a complete inner transformation, for without this, we cannot possibly come to identify ourselves with the other person. We have to become, in some sense, the person we love, and this involves a kind of death of our own being, our own self. No matter how hard we try, we resist this death. We fight back with anger, with recriminations, with demands, with ultimatums. We seek any convenient excuse to break off and give up the difficult task.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's profound and very educational. Now we're all hungry for all those books and quotes.
That's right.
Get all that, books and quotes that you had, because it's so useful for all of us,
Yes, yes.
If anybody has questions, you can type it on the chat line, or you can raise your hand up and identify yourself and ask the question audio. Dr. Channing, I have a personal question which always I sort of wonder listening to all the spiritual leaders and spirituality.
Yes.
And what is the difference between a true religion versus spirituality, and how it is more beneficial than adhering to any religion, whether it's a Hinduism, Christianity, or Islam? Your mind is a little more open-minded with spirituality.
That's a great question. I appreciate that. The way I think about it is that religions often give a lot of beliefs, and sometimes people can hold too tightly to those beliefs, and can even be kind of bothersome with their beliefs. Whereas spirituality is about an experience of letting go and being in the present moment. I think of it's like the psychological goal, as Jack Kornfield says, is to build a sense of self, whereas the spiritual task is to let go of self. So spirituality is where we learn to let go.
The other question I had, Dr. Chen, is you have given an exhaustive experience with the Buddhist teaching. Has the Buddhist teaching has changed you, or is it different than what your traditional Western way teaching psychology?
Well, that's a good question. You know, so many Western psychologists have really been quite taken with the wisdom of Buddhism, that what I say to my patients is that the Buddhists have been studying the mind for over 2,000 years. And so the Buddhists know a great deal about what makes for peace of mind. Patients who come for psychotherapy rarely have peace of mind. And so with Buddhist ideas and Buddhist teachings, we learn to let go of negative thought patterns and be able to simply be in the present moment and not taken away from the moment with negativity.
We have one question from the chat line. Srinivasan, what happened? He wanted to elaborate
On karma.
on
Yeah.
karma.
Yes, I saw the question. Yeah, as I was saying earlier, many people in the West have the idea that karma is fate. It's like your destiny. Whereas, you know, the Buddhist idea of karma is that with all of our actions, every word that we say, every single thing we do, we are constantly creating our own futures. And the life I'm living right now is the result partly of all the decisions I've made in the past. So it behooves us to be very careful and thoughtful in all our words, in all our actions, so that we don't create negative karma for ourselves and for others. It's like every word matters, every action matters.
Dr. Chen, one more question. At what stage in the psychology, the treatment, your treatment, or you advise resorting to the pharmacological treatment, or you kind of work with the pharmacological treatment and psychology at the same time?
That's a great question. I certainly, you know, when I used to practice with Dr. Biliar, I had the nice advantage of having a great psychiatrist right in my office. So it was very easy to send my patients down the hall to Dr. Biliar's office. I no longer have a psychiatrist in my immediate practice, but I do work very closely with psychiatrists. And I tend to think of psychotherapy as we need to look under every rock in our efforts to help our patients. And under every rock includes psychopharmacology. You know, when I see patients who are really burdened with severe anxiety, severe depression, mood swings, suicidal ideation. It's often extremely valuable for these patients to get pharmacologic advice. And so I refer to psychiatrists that I have confidence in who are, very friendly to psychotherapy practice.
I have one question, if that's
Yes.
okay. This is about the anger issues.
Yes.
Sometimes they're not to do with the current situation or the current person. They are disproportionately showing anger because of the backstory, something that happened in their childhood. But because they did not go for psychotherapy, everybody is confused and lost as to how to deal with their situation.
Can you ask the question again as I'm thinking about it?
Oh, okay. So like somebody seems disproportionately angry at a situation where you feel, okay, where is this coming from? So it may have to do with their childhood experience, or maybe they were abused at some state. But unless they seek help, how will they know?
Well, certainly people need to seek help. I often quote Henry David Thoreau, who said, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And I think often people who've not gone for psychotherapy lead lives of quiet desperation. I really believe everyone can benefit from psychotherapy. And certainly in psychotherapy, we look a lot at a person's past, at the events of trauma and abuse in the past, and treatment by angry parents or angry peers in childhood or adolescence. And so sometimes we need to use particular treatments for that trauma. EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, is a particular tool for helping patients who've been traumatized in the past. And so, very often, I certainly agree with you, people's anger is rooted in negative and painful experiences from the past that we need to unearth and address, and sometimes do trauma work.
In some cultures, men are reluctant to admit there is a problem and go for help, which doesn't help anybody.
Yes, yeah, and what I appreciate about Terrence Real, who's a Boston psychotherapist who does a lot of work with men and a lot of work with couples, what Terrence Real says is that particularly that men, and when he's talking about men, he says most of us as men have been wounded in the course of childhood or adolescence by peers or by parents, often with an impact on our self-esteem, sometimes as adults with addictive behaviors. And so he says that couples often come to him after 10, 15, 20 years together, and over what he finds is the wives have grown bitter and resentful because they haven't pushed harder for what they need, because they've been afraid of triggering their husband's anger or shame. And so I encourage the women I work with to read Terrence Real's book, How Can I Get Through to You? To empower them to push harder in their marriages for what they need from their husbands. And when I have husbands who read that book, they say, "Oh, so that's what I've been doing."
Wade has a question there, Wade. Will you ask? You had put in the chat line, go and.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this. How can we accept ourselves unconditionally if we don't get any validation from anybody that we're good for anything? So a lot of us are isolated and we have nobody, and we don't even know we're good for anything. It makes it very difficult.
It's very difficult if we're isolated. We, as Dr. Wasudev and I were talking earlier, it's so important to have a good community, a loving, supportive, generous community. And I think that the Hindu community, the Hindu community in Nashville certainly exhibits a lot of that kind of care and compassion for members of the community. It's very, very difficult. The Buddhist teachings are still helpful. Learning the loving kindness teachings, learning to let go of the inner critic voice, But these practices are much harder without a supportive community.
I have a question. This is Uma.
Yes. Yes.
The question, when it comes to meditation by practice is very good, and it is done. How about the people who are constantly haunted by hallucinations in a psychiatric situation? How can they keep their mind calm enough to meditate?
Well, you're describing a very difficult situation, and
Yes.
certainly a lot of those patients benefit from psychopharmacology, and often medications help them with their hallucinations. But there are other. For example, it makes me think of walking meditation, for example. Thich Nhat Hanh is a big advocate of walking meditation. Sometimes our minds are just so busy that trying to follow the breath, or if someone's having hallucinations, then sometimes walking meditation, where I simply pay attention to the physical sensations of my feet as each foot lands on the ground and then lifts off the ground. And I use that as my object of meditation rather than the breath.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Any other questions you have? If not, that was an excellent talk. Giving a good hand there.
Thank you.
By the way, this talk has been recorded. If you personally want to review it, or your family or friends want to listen, it's a good recording that comes very clear. Just send me an email and I'll forward that recording to you. It takes about 24 hours to get the recording back.
What about the manuscript? Do you think Dr. Channing might be able to share that with people?
Well, actually, everything that I read is on my website.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Can you type your website there on the chat line?
Let's see if I can. Let's see. Let's see if I can. Whoops.
On the chat line.
Here we go. Let's see. My website is, whoops.
I like that challenge about dropping the storyline too.
Dropping the storyline, yes.
I don't think it's that easy.
Not easy.
And the bibliography of the books that you mentioned, the authors.
Yes. Yeah, the bibliography that I read is, let me finish typing this. All right, so there's my website. And the bibliography is actually on, let me find it here. Yes, it's on the very last page on my individual therapy page of my website. And the title of the articles are listed alphabetically: Healing Narcissistic Wounds and Learning to Love. And you go to the last page and that has the bibliography.
Okay, thank you. Again, we appreciate your time, and I'm sure we'll invite you again. A lot of people probably didn't even know what a treasure trove it was today.
Thank you.
The ideas and practices and examples of how it is done, therefore people can see theory and practice together in this session. And I really appreciate you doing that. And I'm glad my audience got some glimpse of what can be done in psychotherapy. That's another thing, particularly our community may not know value of psychotherapy at all.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you, Veda.
All these recordings are on our website. I typed the website www.icSSS.org, and even the past recording for the last 8-9 months are there. It's very easy to click on the recordings and you will hear the whole session there. Again, thanks for all of you, and hope you have a nice weekend and stay safe. I think COVID is gradually going away.
Yeah.
If you're not taking the fifth vaccine. That's a bivalent vaccine, booster dose. Those are easily available now in most of the drugstores. So enjoy, and I'll end the meeting here. Thanks again, Dr.
You're welcome.
Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you very much.
Thank you. Very welcome. Very welcome.
Thank you.
You.